Interpersonal Conflict, Chapter 1, by Joyce Hopper and Dave Lemon. This is the 10th edition.
Welcome to Conflict Management, Com 206. Interpersonal Conflict is our textbook by Hocker and Wilmot, the 10th edition. One of the major insights into conflict that you learn in Chapter 1 is that perception is really the basis for conflicts and how they proceed. Perception is at the core of conflict. We perceive others, they perceive us, we perceive the relationships. These are very important ideas to remember. Conflicts that are muddled and unclear remain unsolved. But even if you unmuddled them and you made them clear, it doesn't mean you can resolve a conflict. Not all conflicts can be resolved, but they can be managed more productively or positively. Conflict resolution occurs when there is a presence of behavior change that either you or the other person or something about the relationship overall changes. Hocker and Wilmot are sure to define conflict in a number of ways. But the one that I want to settle on to help us clarify the focus of our course is the one that begins, conflict is an expressed struggle. Because the notion of an expressed struggle means that we're focusing on communication, what conflict participants are saying and doing. So how they are verbally, and verbal means with words, so it can be written or spoken, and non-verbally, meaning with your body, with your images that you might put on your body or adorn your body with, how you surround yourself with artifacts. All those things are nonverbal communication, including eye contact and how you are moving your body and using facial expressions. Verbally and non-verbally, the communication is reflecting your styles and tactics, which is actually what's going to be discussed in Chapter 5 of our text. So conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two, so two or more. If you're having an intrapersonal conflict, that's within yourself. Interpersonal conflict is between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, and goals, the TRIP goals, TRIP, topic, relational, identity, and process goals, are discussed in Chapter 3. You might also perceive scarce resources and interference from others in achieving their goals. That's RICE, or power currencies, as discussed in Chapter 4. RICE is the acronym, and it stands for resource control, interpersonal linkages, communication skills, and expertise. So again, conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. I want to reiterate that we are talking in this class about interpersonal approaches to conflict management, or interpersonal conflict. Intrapersonal, INTRA, is about what's going on inside of you. It's about what's conflicting you in your internal dialogue. Or perhaps you're having some difficulty or tension in some of your thoughts and your feelings. But it's about being inside yourself. Not inside or attempting to be inside or attempting to understand someone else. Intrapersonal communication and conflict, intrapersonal conflict, are about oneself. Interpersonal conflict is about the communicated or communication exchanges that make up the conflict episode. Again, how the struggle is expressed. This might seem repetitive, but it's an important enough point to repeat. Communication is the central element, and it's about communication overall, and communication involves our perceptions of when conflicts start, and conflicts start when they're expressed, and usually they are activated by a triggering event. So it's our communication behavior that often creates conflict, that often reflects conflict, and that is often the vehicle for the productive or destructive management of conflict. Let's focus for a minute on the term interdependence. Conflict parties engage in an expressed struggle and are perceived to interfere with one another because they are interdependent. Each person's choices in that communication moment affect the other because conflict is a mutual activity. When conflict is strategic, it means that both parties have choices, as opposed to conflict in which the power is so disparate or different or uneven that there are virtually no choices. Partners in strategic conflict must have mutual interest in order to move the conflict forward in a positive way. In conflict, parties may also be locked into mutual interdependence, and that is because of the relationship that they have. Gridlock conflicts, on the other hand, can be stuck in unproductive interdependence. Sometimes we have to step back and say, maybe I need to end a particular type of relationship, meaning I need to lessen or remove my interdependence from someone in order to make my life better. The word gridlock is an interesting one because if you imagine traffic in a major city like New York City. When they talk about gridlock, you can't do anything. You are controlled by the situation going on around you. When you feel like you are in gridlock and controlled by the other person who you are interdependent with in your relationship, you may feel rejected by your partner. You may keep talking, but you don't make any headway. So just like people honk their horns, it doesn't mean people are going to move forward. You become entrenched and are unwilling to budge, so you stick to your guns, so to speak, meaning that you stick to your beliefs and your values and your positions, regardless of whether they're right or wrong. You might feel more frustrated and hurt after you talk than before. And your talk is devoid of humor, amusement, or affection. It just is. It's just talk. There's no indication that you're trying to connect with the other person. You may become more entrenched over time, so you become insulting during your talk. This is when things might begin to escalate in negative ways. More vilification makes you more polarized, extreme, and less willing to compromise. Compromise is one of the 5 choices that you have to approaching conflict, which you will learn about in Chapter 5. Eventually, you may disengage emotionally or physically or both. That's what's important here, is that we have a choice when we are engaged in relationships and engaged in relationships that may not be healthy relationships. Those that lead to conflict, gridlock, intrapersonal distress, those are the relationships that we might have to re-examine to see if we need to move forward. Goals is one of the primary foci within that conflict definition that I gave you earlier. And here it's about the perceived incompatibility of goals that causes conflict. We perceive that somebody is interfering with our achievement of some of these goals. Goals are perceived as incompatible because perhaps we think that both parties or conflict participants want the same thing, and you can't have the same thing. I want an entire pie, and you want an entire pie, but we only see one pie. That would be an example of we want the same thing. Or different things. Maybe I want to pursue other relationships and you don't. That is something that we're going to have to look at. Those goals would be incompatible. First, the conflict parties may want the same thing. For example, the promotion in a company. Maybe the scholarship that's available. Or if you have siblings, the attention of the parents. You're constantly jockeying and struggling for position in order to attain your desired goal. They perceive the situation, so let's think of siblings as being in conflict, as one where there isn't enough to go around, as though that their parents' love is finite, and that if they can get 3/4, that means there's only 1/4 left for the other. But this does not make sense when you think about love. Love can be infinite. So they see their goal as incompatible because they both want the same thing, and yet they think that that thing is limited. In interpersonal conflict, there's always this perception of scarce resources. Again, perception. Two resources that are often perceived as scarce are power and self-esteem. This is where Chapter 4 on power currencies and attempting to use those within conflict become extraordinarily important. When it comes to interference, if you perceive that the presence of another person interferes with your desired actions, that's when conflict can intensify. Again, it's about interference, but it's perceived interference. The other person may not even be intentionally trying to interfere, but you might perceive them as interfering. So why do we want to study conflict? Can't we just ignore it and make it go away? Well, I think most of you who are taking this course are either communication majors, business majors, teachers, you might be social workers. In any position that you are thinking about taking, in any relationship you have, and that not only means romantic relationships, but work relationships, student-teacher relationships, and so on. Your mental health and overall happiness improve when you have constructive conflict processes that you can engage in. That takes time and energy and practice. If we don't, we are likely to repeat the same damaging patterns that we see on the job, in our homes, and even in our classrooms. One of the key places and first places that we learn about conflict is in our families. And in Chapter 2, you're going to learn more about other factors that influence your perceptions of conflict. But our family of origin socializes us into either constructive or destructive ways of handling conflict. For example, destructive marital conflict, if you have parents or guardians who have really gone at each other in very negative ways, that can have system-wide effects on family members and how they will grow, develop, and then themselves engage in or not conflict. Children who are exposed to harsh discipline practices at home are also more at risk for aggression, hyperactivity, and internalizing by withdrawing, having somatic complaints, bodily aches, for example, and experiencing depressive symptoms. So those of you who are interested in bullying, you have to consider that there are children who come from homes that aren't often positive environments for them, and the only way they know how to communicate with others is through bullying, whether it's physical, emotional, or mental. A child's general feeling of self-worth is directly affected by how their parents or guardians interact. What about love relationships or romantic relationships? What determines the course of a relationship, says Wilmot from 1995, is in large measure determined by how successfully the participants move through conflict episodes. So sometimes we say, oh, we never argue. We never have conflict. Each relationship has conflicts, but sometimes they are not engaged. They are avoided. Couples must learn to process fights, to engage in what's called meta communication. So couples must learn to process fights and other disagreeable events rather than repeating them and taking the chance of destroying a relationship. Processing an argument means that the partners discuss the argument without redoing the fight. They talk about how they do conflict. They talk about the patterns that they each engage in. And they talk about that in ways that can lead them to productive conflicts in the future. And that one key skill in long-term committed relationships is conflict management. My husband and I, my partner and I, whoever you are, may disagree, but it doesn't mean that it has to end a relationship because you disagree. It's about how you manage that conflict. Let's think about the workplace for a moment. Conflicts at work present challenges that could affect your career development. It may help you decide between taking a risk and not taking a risk, between chatting with your boss about what's going on in your life or not, about sharing your successes with your coworkers. As an employee, getting along with coworkers, managers, and the public will help you become perceived as skilled. Right? You want to be able to communicate effectively with all the different levels of people that are there in terms of their status within the hierarchy of the organization. Once you do that and people perceive you as more skilled, you might actually be looked to as the person who can help solve workplace conflict. And again, workplace conflict might include your classroom if you're going to be a teacher. So to reiterate, the importance of skill development is what is really important. Practice, practice, practice. Conflict management is learned over time with practice. It's not something that you're born with. Unresolved conflicts can have a tremendous negative impact on you, your health, on others and their health, and on your relationship. Everyone loses in that situation. Conflict management needs to draw upon the skills of emotional intelligence, or your EQ, which is one of the major chapters in their book, which is chapter 6 on emotions. The capacity, says Goleman, for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, and for managing emotions well in ourselves and in our relationships. Conflict management means being emotionally intelligent, being aware of your own feelings, the other person's feelings, and what else might be contributing to that within the environment or the situation. take a quick look at the two components of emotional intelligence, or your EQ, your self-awareness and your self-management. Your self-awareness is about your emotional self-awareness. It's about having an accurate self-assessment and about your level of self-confidence. Your self-management has to do with your self-control and trustworthiness. Think about trustworthiness in the sense of other people have to perceive you as being trustworthy. Also, your conscientiousness, adaptability, how much you are oriented towards your achievements or your goals, and the initiative that you're willing to take. So you have two components of your emotional intelligence: self-awareness and self-management. Now we take a quick look at emotional intelligence in terms of others. How do we have emotional intelligence outside of ourselves? That has to do with our social awareness. What is our ability to empathize or to have empathy? Are we aware of what's going on in the organization, in the culture, in the classroom? Do we have a service orientation, trying to help others? Social skills. Are we able to help others become good leaders, to influence them in positive ways, to develop them in ways that they hadn't thought about before, to communicate effectively, to be a change catalyst when change is needed, to manage conflicts? Notice number 18 is about conflict management, which is the focus of this course. Also in building bonds or relationships and engaging in teamwork and collaboration. I add this particular moment in the video because I think it's quite intuitive for us. In the Chinese language, the character for conflict is made up of two different symbols. One that indicates danger and the other that indicates opportunity. Chapter 2 is really going to focus on both of these, and it's going to identify the ways in which we engage in perceiving things as either dangerous or as opportunities. These two approaches decide whether you respond to a conflict as though it's dangerous, or a war, for example, or whether you experience conflict as a welcome opportunity for change. One of the metaphors used in Chapter 2 is as a dance or a music improvisation, or even quilt making, where you see it as an opportunity to do something together. Once we choose to engage in conflict, we can do it destructively or constructively. So let's take a look at destructive conflict. This is the type of conflict that Hocker and Wilmot want us to avoid. When we're trying to prevent something from happening, we're trying to anticipate it, right? We know that it's going to come. We want to try to stop it from coming. We want to be ready for the occasion. We want to deprive something else, perhaps, of power. And we want to hold or keep back and to deal with it beforehand. Kind of nip it in the bud, right, is a garden metaphor that they would use. Prevention implies taking advance measures. And if you think about it, again, we often think we have advanced measures because we think we have scripts, social scripts that we follow, certain patterns that we engage in, that we can anticipate. If I say this word or this phrase, this is where the conversation will go. So prevention implies taking effective measures then to ward off something destructive, to try to put it on a straight and narrow, which is more constructive. If all participants are dissatisfied with the outcomes of a conflict and they think they have lost as a result, then the conflict is classified as destructive. I would also like to have you think about if you are always out to win and you come away feeling good about yourself, but the other person doesn't, that's also destructive for the relationship. It might end the conflict, but it has implications for something larger.
Of the apocalypse. What a great phrase that Hawking and Wilmot use. Think about people and death. And that this four horsemen means that the steps that we're taking are leading to their own destruction. The four horsemen of the apocalypse include a destructive pattern. We criticize, engage in defensiveness, stonewall, and then demonstrate your contempt.
One of the ways that destructive conflict rears its ugly head, so to speak, is when we think about the phrase, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I like that Hocker and Wilmot use this particular model because it shows us that very often when we're in a destructive conflict, we can almost anticipate, right, what's going to happen. And instead of preventing it, we engage in it. So we might begin by criticizing the other, becoming defensive, then stonewalling, and then engaging in contempt. The four horsemen will become important because you might decide when you are analyzing the video, the Rosie and Elizabeth video for your conflict analysis paper, or in looking at other videos that you might be engaging in, TV shows, films, and so on, or even in your real life, that these four horsemen show up more often than not. And if we can recognize them, that means we can also change the shape of the conflict, change its direction, and make it more constructive. When you are criticizing someone, you say things that give the sense to the other person that the blame is on them. You always do this. You never do that. Then if they become defensive, or then you become defensive because they often will mirror your behavior, so they might criticize you, you imply that you're warding off an attack. No, I'm not. I don't always do that. You always do that. That would be an example. Stonewalling is the third phase, if you will, of this four horsemen of the apocalypse. And it happens when you decide that you're not really going to participate in that conflict at that moment, right? You might roll your eyes, turn your head, think about your avoidant behaviors here. And then lastly, contempt is when your nonverbal behavior puts you on a higher plane than your partner. You might be condescending or sarcastic or, God forbid, snarky. How a conflict begins doesn't mean that that's how the conflict has to continue. So one of the things we can do as conflict participants is to raise awareness and become more aware of our own critical sense of startups for conflict, because a critical sense or tone sets up conflict for destruction. Some examples of harsh and critical startups might include phrases like, I'm still furious and we have to talk, right? It kind of puts a burden on the other person. If you could spare me a few minutes from your busy schedule, already putting some snarkiness into that. I'd like to talk to you. Would you just listen to me for once in your life? Again, not often a good way to start a productive or constructive conflict. You are skating on thin ice. You consider this a report I could send off? What are you, crazy? That's the implication at the end. Here's your date for your performance review. Just starting with that is able to put someone on edge, especially in the workplace. And then many of you may have also used or have experienced the phrase, as though I care what you think. These are not good ways and positive ways to start conflicts. So you might be saying, well, what can I do instead? Well, since we're using the word constructive, and we can use it in multiple ways. A constructive complaint. Now that might seem like an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp. But a constructive complaint means that you are framing it in a particular way so that others can respond rather than react or retaliate. So instead of a harsh startup or a critical startup, you can turn that conflict into something positive using a constructive complaint that can point the other person toward a change in behavior. Specifically, a constructive complaint consists of an I statement describing the undesirable behavior. When you do X, I feel X. When you criticize my weight, I feel humiliated. And then you can use non-neutral or use neutral, non-judgmental language. Again, I'm not saying that you're bad for doing that. I'm saying when you do this, I feel this. And then you can ask for a specific change. This is what will be discussed in Chapter 2 as the XYZ formula. So if you say to someone, when you call me fat, I feel humiliated. I would like for you not to do that in the future. And that can even be made even clearer to help us. Stonewalling is the third part of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It is about withdrawal from interaction, not just leaving an interaction physically, but really indicating and communicating to someone else that you are trying to remove yourself from the conversation. But you usually are trying to do it in a destructive way, such as refusal to participate in the conversation. I know in many conflicts we hear phrases like, I'm not doing this anymore. My apologies for the interruption. Contempt is the fourth aspect or part of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Again, that is about destructive conflict. It's when your nonverbal behavior puts yourself on a higher plane than your partner. It involves perhaps mockery, put-downs, hostile corrections, and nonverbal expressions of contempt. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of this in our political system over the past 5-6 years. Contempt is never justified in long-term important relationships because it involves an attack on the personhood, what we call ad hominem attacks. You attack the person and who they are rather than trying to discuss and have conversations about behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and so forth. In addition to ad hominem or personal attacks, two other behaviors might also impact destructive conflict. If you are rigid, if you are so rigid and stuck in your beliefs because the goal is to be right rather than to help the relationship and the other person and yourself move forward, then flexibility is not present. What you really want to do if you want to move from destructive to constructive conflict is to try to think of your boundaries as not closed lines, but more dotted lines, more fluid, so that you can accept more behavior and information and perceptions of others rather than be stuck with one view or belief or value. Also, the power that you have, the perceptions of power. Again, Chapter 4 is going to really discuss power in a great way. But unequal power, that's a bad habit. If I am always the one in charge and I dominate and I make sure that I'm clear to indicate to you that you are subordinate or lesser than me, that's going to result in destructive conflict. Many times, this happens in the workplace where someone who is older than you or who has been at the job longer than you may believe that they are your superior because they have time on the job. Here you will see more examples of destructive habits. Take a look at these and think about the ones that you might engage in, and then think about how you might make or change those habits from destructive to constructive so that you can engage in conflicts that can produce positive relationships and maintain those rather than ending them after long periods of time. Once conflict becomes destructive, it often moves very quickly into what we call an escalatory spiral. Usually that term is viewed as negative. When something escalates, it intensifies. But I think we can also shift that a little bit into other types of styles when we get to chapter 5. But here, when they talk about escalation and these escalatory spirals, they are talking about the four horsemen of the apocalypse and how the intensity and the behaviors change in destructive ways. Escalatory spirals that are negative are characterized by overt and implied expression of the conflict. You know when conflict is intensifying. You might see somebody's face turn red. You might see them take a stronger stance. You might see them roll their eyes. You might hear them use particular words that you know means that conflict is happening. So be more aware of escalatory spirals in the negative sense so that you can convert those to more positive spirals. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that sometimes behaviors of one person get mirrored by the other person or repeated. So remember when you were little and you might have agitated a friend or a sibling or a parent by repeating and doing everything they do? Well, that can happen as well in conflict. If you have a low intensity emotion, it is often responded to in kind. Again, think about your tone of voice, how you present yourself, what you're saying and what you're doing. If you have a high intensity emotion, that too will be met in kind. So if you raise your voice, typically other people raise their voice, and then before you know it, we're yelling and screaming at each other. So we want to remember that high intensity and low intensity emotions are often mirrored. So if you realize that you are having a high intensity emotion, think about whether or not you can find another emotion that has less intensity so that the other person might be able to mirror that behavior or emotion in the moment. Sometimes low intensity emotion is met with high intensity emotion. And the reason why that might occur is because somebody might think that if you aren't really strongly connected to a particular emotion, that if they demonstrate that they are connected intensely to an emotion, that they can influence you in particular ways. They might view that as a power currency within the conflict. When we mirror somebody else's destructive behavior, we often think of this as retaliation. Retaliation runs rampant in destructive conflicts because we put the idea of resolving a conflict aside and we want to win. So in a sense, we don't want a mutual resolution. We want a one-way resolution that favors us. It destroys chances for change if all we have is retaliation. Think about the number of times that participants, and maybe yourselves, have piled up small grudges, grievances, right? You store them away. And for those of you who are hunters, we have a gunny sack It's a sack that you carry on your back. Think of this as where you put your grudges and you put your grievances. And you may not address them as they're all happening. And then suddenly one day, boom, right? The gunny sack is opened and you start to express all of your grudges and grievances, even though they might not be related to the moment of conflict that you're having. So gunny sacking may feel good because you feel like you're being the better person by not complaining, but when you hit that wall and you suddenly get into your gunny sack, it's going to explode. So you have many opportunities to improve your conflict skills, and hopefully you will use each chapter and each assignment as a way to do so. In every aspect of life, we need better principles for resolving conflict and promoting harmony within ourselves and others. We need approaches that make personal and political sense, that connect us in a rational and caring manner to ourselves as individuals and to the world around us, including people and nature. We need a viewpoint that helps us understand and heal the pain of human conflict. And I think that's very apropos for everything going on in the world at this point in time.
In summary, although there's a lot listed here in this one last slide that was taken from the textbook in chapter 1, I want to reiterate that conflict is defined as an expressed struggle that's expressed in unique ways. So we have to look at what people are saying and what people are doing, verbally and non-verbally. It occurs between two parties at least, could be 3, 4, 5, who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. We have destructive conflicts that can damage relationships, even end them, and those patterns can turn into spirals each time we engage in conflict. What we want to do is we want to engage in a more positive, healthier, manageable type